Okay, let's get started. Right, the first thing I want to do is look ahead to next week and show you guys where things are located on Canvas for the readings that we'll be doing. So let's look at the syllabus. I'll show you where the readings are. So for the final week of readings, we're going to be reading from Adorno. I actually have a announcement on this. From the previous iteration of the course. So what we're going to do is we'll do selections from Adorno's Negative Dialectics on Monday and Tuesday, along with some supplemental readings. And those supplemental readings are as follows. So for Monday, it will include Why Still Philosophy, Reflections on Class Theory and Imaginative Excesses. Relatively short. And then we will also have some selections from lectures that Adorno gave called Metaphysics, Concepts, and Problems that are slightly different formulated but similar content. They're kind of draft versions of the sections of Negative Dialectics we'll be reading. For Thursday of next week, we have several essays by Adorno: Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, Subject and Object, Marginalia to Theory and Praxis, and Resignation. All right, and we will see that Negative Dialectics picks up pretty much directly, the beginning of Negative Dialectics picks up directly from the Korsch Marxism and Philosophy that we'll be discussing tonight. So I need volunteers for presenters for next week. So for Monday, would anyone like to volunteer to post notes to the discussion threads and present them? Well, the final week is the sort of intense crunch time, I suppose, especially with the final papers, but still would be useful. So no volunteers. Anyone for Tuesday or Thursday? So is it a question of Monday or it's just next week? Everyone has presented so far? All right, maybe I'll come back to asking for volunteers later. We have a relatively low turnout today. I'm going to discuss the paper assignments, the options that we have in the prompts on Canvas. So let me, first of all, bring up that announcement and bring up the assignments just to discuss what the formal requirements are. So because the summer course, relatively short, that means a short paper rather than a longer paper. Now what we have is 3 different assignments. They're all in one file. linked in the announcement on Canvas. The first being the bourgeois philosophy readings that we did from Rousseau, Smith, Kant, Benjamin Constant, and Hegel. The second being Marx's writings. And the third being Lukács, Korsch, and Adorno's writings. So basically pre-Marx, Marx, and Marxism. And as I mentioned in the announcement to Canvas, I have some crib notes and some suggested potential kind of topics or questions around the material. But you're free to write however you'd like on these sections of readings from the course. So really it's a opportunity for you to do a deep dive to kind of tease out and elaborate the implications, or sort of interrogate, analyze closely and interrogate the readings that we did, depending on what you're interested in writing about. So again, roughly these 3 different topics, but those are just really subdivisions of the readings that we've done in this course. So we'll be looking to for you guys to focus on 1 or 2 readings from the first 2 weeks, middle 2 weeks, or final 2 weeks of the course. And those will be submitted via email on the Sunday after our final class, because grades will be due the following week. And please email them directly to me as Microsoft Word or PDF files. I won't be able to open, because I have Microsoft machines, I won't be able to open the Apple Pages documents. So it will either be Microsoft Word or PDF, and directly via email, the email listed on the prompt or on the syllabus, rather than a message through Canvas, which means I have to log on to Canvas to reply to. I'd rather have everything in my inbox. So 4 to 5 double-spaced pages, which is approximately 1,000 words. Actually, should have put that in the announcement, I realize. I'll edit this. So like I said, a short paper. Any questions about the paper? Okay, if you do have any questions, feel free to write me. And if you want any clarification, or if you want to sort of bounce any ideas off me as you're working on the papers, you can write me directly about that. Let's see. Any of the prompts. Yeah, any one of the 3. So choose one of the 3. All right. All right, let's get into the Korsch. It's a peculiar reading in some ways, and but it's going to transition us to the Adorno readings we're doing for next week. Okay, so the title of the course: Critical Society, Philosophy and Modernity, Marx and Marxism. So usually when we think of philosophy, we think of a way of thinking, a method of thinking. We think of some kind of formal philosophy. We think of maybe a method of analyzing things logically. So what's peculiar here is the idea that philosophy itself might be a symptom, or might be a form of appearance. So rather than taking one or another philosophical view of capitalism, the idea that any philosophical view, not only of capitalism but of anything, any philosophical view is a symptom, is an ideology. So ideology critique, we go all the way back to Marx's first, among the first readings we did, the first day of readings from Marx, the 1843 letter to Arnold Ruge, his editor and publisher and potential collaborator in a journal project that he wanted to start. And he said, we could begin anywhere with our critique. We could begin with religion, philosophy, science. We could begin with economics, or we could begin with the political system. Really, we could start anywhere, and that would just give us an angle or a specific set of phenomena with which to pursue an immanent dialectical critique, meaning to find the contradiction of our present way of life as manifesting in any specific domain of appearance, any specific set of phenomena. So again, that itself sounds like a philosophy, except it isn't, because even that, the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, would itself be a symptom. So what we're going to find is, in a way that we started to look at with Lukács, the Marxist critique of Marxism. In other words, if Marxism had become reified through a kind of reformist revisionism, through a kind of reification, naturalization of the working class's own movement and organization, its own social and political organizations, its own class struggle, its own forms of class struggle, including its political forms of revolution, including the dictatorship of the proletariat, to regard all of that as a symptomatic expression of capitalism, as bound up with capitalism, as an expression of capitalism, as, again, phenomena of capitalism. Because what we're concerned with here, in terms of the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, is the self-overcoming of capitalism. Meaning, the proletariat as the expression of, as a phenomenon of, the proletariat itself, the proletarianized working class itself, including in its class struggle and in its struggle for socialism, itself as a symptom, a pathological expression of capitalism. And if we recall, what is capitalism? It's the contradiction of bourgeois society by the industrial forces of production. Also, we could think of it as the self-contradiction of the bourgeois social relations, or of bourgeois society, the self-contradiction of the industrial forces of production at this stage in history. And the proletariat would be an expression of that, would be a manifestation of that, would be a phenomenon of that. So the identical subject-object of history, that's the way Lukács described the proletariat, as the self-identical subject-object of history, meaning the self-overcoming of the proletariat would be the self-overcoming of capitalism. So the proletariat, in a sense, the embodiment of capitalism, and the self-overcoming of the proletariat would be the self-overcoming of capitalism. So capitalism is not going to be overcome from outside, but from within itself. And the primary mover of capitalism is the proletarianized working class. The class struggle is the driver of industrialization in both of its phases, according to Marxism. So the class struggle, the struggle for the bourgeois rights of the working class, is what produced the Industrial Revolution, what produced the self-contradiction of capitalism, the division of the value of labor into wage labor and capital. And that's all the way up to and including the socialist movement, the communist movement, the revolutionary organizations, political parties, and that would also include the dictatorship of the proletariat itself as the final stage of the self-contradiction of capitalism. And indeed, the dictatorship of the proletariat would be the manifestation, in a political sense, of the self-contradiction of the working class. So when we're talking about the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena, we're talking about something that is specific to capitalism. We'll get into it next week. There are sort of two ways of thinking about it. Lukács talked about it as positive and negative dialectics. So we could say the positive dialectic is the bourgeois dialectic, the dialectic of the emancipation and revolutionizing of labor. And then the negative dialectic being the dialectic of capitalism. Right, so because we live in bourgeois society contradicted by capitalism, we live also in the contradiction of the positive and negative sides of the dialectic. What does that mean? Something that we'll talk about again next week with Adorno and the reflections on class theory. The dialectic itself is itself self-contradictory, meaning the dialectic points beyond itself. The dialectic actually points beyond itself. Okay, so meaning this method or this procedure or this way things move historically would itself have to be overcome. So philosophy as ideology or philosophy as false consciousness, philosophy in its highest expression, Hegelian philosophy as the highest expression of bourgeois philosophy. We'll see that Korsch calls this the philosophy of revolution, meaning the philosophy of bourgeois revolution. That itself, philosophy, became self-contradictory in capitalism and points beyond itself. Points to the self-overcoming of philosophy. So I think that we talked about this with Kant and Hegel, the 25 years of philosophy, meaning the beginning of philosophy in this emphatic sense of a philosophy of revolution and of bourgeois revolution in particular, inaugurated by Kant and completed by Hegel. So there would be really three different ways of thinking about philosophy. There'd be philosophy before it achieves its bourgeois self-consciousness in the 25 years of philosophy from Kant to Hegel. So there would be sort of traditional philosophy with some roots of this revolutionary philosophy that then come together in Kant and culminate in Hegel. Then there's the 25 years of philosophy itself. There's revolutionary philosophy. And then there is what comes after that, the philosophy after Hegel. Is Marx a philosopher? No, he's not. And yet, he also carries on the task and the mission of that earlier bourgeois philosophy of Kant and Hegel. Because Marx is still the philosophy of revolution, albeit under changed conditions. So not under conditions of the bourgeois emancipation of labor, but under the conditions of the task of overcoming bourgeois society and bourgeois labor presented by capitalism. So just as capitalism is bourgeois society in self-contradiction and crisis, Marxism expresses, in this dimension, the self-contradiction and crisis of bourgeois revolutionary philosophy. Why is that important? Because there still is bourgeois revolutionary philosophy in the capitalist era. Indeed, Marx and Engels considered socialism and communism, the socialism and communism that predated them, as a continuation of this bourgeois society of revolution, but unaware of, manifesting, but unself-conscious about its self-contradiction. Whereas Marxism is that self-conscious socialism and communism. And that's what it means to say scientific socialism. So when we think of Marxism's identification of itself as scientific and not utopian socialism predates Marx and Engels. Scientific socialism doesn't mean like a natural or physical science. It doesn't mean empirical or objective science in that respect, physical or natural science. It means science in the way that Hegel called his philosophy scientific. So Hegel called his philosophy scientific, but in a different, in a looser in one sense, but in a more capacious, but also in a very different sense than we usually think of science. So what was science? It was Wissenschaft, that's the German word. What it meant was, because after all, it wasn't just Hegel, it was Kant also who wanted to make philosophy scientific. Knowledge aware of its own conditions of possibility. So that's science. Science in any domain. Science is knowledge aware of its own condition of possibility. That's Kant's definition of critique. Remember that critique is exploration of conditions of possibility for something. And a self-consciousness of, like a critical self-consciousness, means a self-consciousness aware of its own conditions of possibility, including how it came into being, how it became, but also how it might change, how it might be transformed. So science is only science in this view if it's aware of where it came from and also where it might be going beyond itself. So if you remember one of the criticisms that Marx had of the young Hegelians in his early philosophical writings that we read under the title To Make the World Philosophical, he said that the epigones, the followers, the young Hegelians, received Hegel's philosophy as a ready-made system, whereas for Hegel himself it was not a ready-made system, meaning Hegel was working through it himself, for himself. Whereas they don't work through it, they don't produce it through a kind of working through, but receive it ready-made, and therefore it's something different in their hands than it was in Hegel's own hands. Now that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it, which is what Korsch is going to ask us to consider it as, the historical shift, the historical transformation between Hegel's time and the young Hegelians' time, between Hegel's time and Marx's time, between circa 1800 and the 1830s and 40s. What happened? The Industrial Revolution, or the manifestation of the contradiction of capitalism. So socialism and communism is the expression of that emergence of capitalism with the Industrial Revolution, but as yet unself-consciously, as yet still naively in bourgeois revolutionary terms, unaware of how these bourgeois revolutionary desiderata, goals, criteria, aspirations have become self-contradictory in capitalism, and indeed are themselves an expression of and also a motor force for capitalism. Right? This is an interesting point, because Korsch is writing in 1923. He's writing in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, still as yet innocent of what will happen in the Soviet Union and with associated states in Eastern Europe and Asia later. The class struggle of the proletarianized working class is bound up with, it's both the cause and the effect of, the Industrial Revolution. The struggle for socialism is also driving. It's an effect of, but also a continuing cause of, industrialization of capitalism. So socialism and communism might help keep capitalism going, insofar as it's an unself-conscious, ideological movement. Socialist revolution even might just be an engine of capitalism. It might just drive capitalist development further rather than getting beyond it. If you recall the end of Lukács's standpoint to the proletariat that we read in last class, he said that the proletariat is faced with the choice of substituting its own positive contents or merely inheriting the desiccated husks of bourgeois society in its decadence, in its reified, ossified, encrusted form. So Marx and Engels approached socialism in their time, the socialism and communism of their time, as an ideological expression of capitalism, as a symptom of capitalism, as a naive, unself-conscious, and therefore simply spontaneously self-contradictory and false consciousness of capitalism, deceiving itself as an opposition to capitalism, whereas really it just was a reflex and a promoter of capitalism, a one-sided dogmatic abstraction, to use Marx's language from 1843 and 1844, that actually maintained, it preserved, it promoted capitalism. Okay, so what would it mean then to do a critique of socialism, critique of communism? A critique of revolutionary consciousness, a critique of revolutionary philosophy, since the young Hegelians were themselves revolutionaries, as were the socialists and communists who were their contemporaries, and often the young Hegelian philosophers, indeed many of them, identified themselves as socialists and communists. So there weren't just these two parallel phenomena, but they were actually connected in their own minds. Hegel was influential for other utopian and other socialists. For instance, Proudhon. Proudhon considered himself Hegelian. See that later Bakunin critiqued Marxism for its Hegelianism, because Bakunin, a later anarchist, considered that Hegelianism to be at the root of Marxism's alleged statism, and it's still being connected with bourgeois philosophy, bourgeois ideology, and bourgeois politics, bourgeois revolutionary politics. So Bakunin, though he was a follower of Proudhon, actually departed from Proudhon in certain respects, and critiqued Marxism as a kind of naively Hegelian and therefore still bourgeois revolutionary, inadequately pointing beyond capitalism, and that happened through its statism as opposed to anarchism. Right, so this is still a problem. It's why the critique of Marxism by the anarchists can seem to apply in the 20th century, especially in light of Stalinism, especially in light of what happened in the Soviet Union and other communist-led states in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Okay. But this is still 1923, it's before that had happened. And yet, looking back on the history, and especially looking back on the crisis of the Second or Socialist International, that had divided it into a new Third or Communist International, it became apparent that even Marxism had succumbed in some respects, or lost an adequate self-consciousness of its own implication in capitalism. I think that I mentioned that the revolutions and the civil wars in the European countries at the end of World War I had the character, very directly, in Russia and Germany and other places like Hungary, where Lukács had participated. Also in Italy, in a funny kind of way, Marxists on both sides, socialists on both sides, shooting at each other. In Italy, the peculiar phenomenon is that Mussolini was a Marxist who invented a new ideology, fascism, and so it was the fascists versus the socialists who became the communists. But still part of a historical precipitate or outgrowth of Marxism, fascism, which was more clear in the Italian case than in the German case. Although in the German case, it's also, because it's inspired by Mussolini, it is part of the fascist movement, but it also has other roots, as did Mussolini fascism. But still, as a response to Marxism, and also in many respects as a direct outgrowth of Marxism, and as an imitator of Marxism on certain scores. So Hitler imitated the Stalinist communists, as well as the older social democratic communists. Okay, so what would it mean to approach this crisis of Marxism, something that Lukács and Korsch have in common? They're addressing a crisis of Marxism. I think that I mentioned that Lukács and Korsch wrote independently of each other. However, they converge on a lot of themes, but they were unaware of each other's work, unaware of each other as individuals, but really land in very similar places. And we will see that Adorno next week, but also others. So we read Horkheimer, and we'll also be looking at other readings from other Frankfurt School members, but the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, the Frankfurt School, they took their inspiration from Lukács and Korsch, and that institute was born out of a few early conferences in the early 1920s, one of which took place in 1923, and they were reading in 1923 both History and Class Consciousness, Lukács, and Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy. And indeed, the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, what became known later as the Frankfurt School, they invited both Lukács and Korsch to become their new director of the institute. And they both turned them down because they wanted to stay active in the Communist Party. Whereas the institute, the Frankfurt Institute, was like a nonpartisan organization. It did include people who were still members of the party, but it was stepping to one side of the party politics, and they wanted to stay more directly engaged. All right. So let's look at how Korsch begins his essay. So you'll recall that Lukács, in his preface to History and Class Consciousness, quoted Lenin about wanting to start a kind of society of the materialist friends of the Hegelian dialectic. Here we have something similar. So Korsch is quoting Lenin again, and he says, "We must organize a systematic study of the Hegelian dialectic from a materialist standpoint." So in both Lukács and Korsch's cases, we have, they are in their deep dive into the history of Marxism and into Marx and Engels' own writings, as well as the writings of Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. They're trying to recover what they consider the idealist dimension of Marxism, namely its Hegelianism, and specifically the dialectic. So the idea, and this is, they're taking their cue from both Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin. Both Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin accused their opponents within the Marxist movement, especially the revisionist, reformist tendency within Marxism. They accused them of being undialectical, that they had lost the plot, that they were no longer Marxist because they were no longer dialectical in their approach. So Lukács and Korsch are both interested in, well, what did that mean? What was the dialectic from a Marxist standpoint? What was this Hegelian dialectic from a Marxist standpoint? But to address that, so the dialectic that we've been tracing in this course has its origins in Rousseau and then is developed in the realm of formal philosophy by Kant and Hegel. It's there in Smith, and it, of course, has its antecedents before Rousseau. Locke, Bernard Mandeville, other Enlightenment thinkers, other bourgeois thinkers. But with regard to German idealism, modern idealism, German idealist philosophy, modern philosophy, the philosophy that encompasses both Kant and Hegel, what is this modern idealism? And what does it mean that it is dialectical? Because Marx and Engels seem to take that for granted, and it's only explicated in the margins, so to speak. All right, here's Korsch, the beginning of his essay. He writes, "Until very recently, neither bourgeois nor Marxist thinkers had much appreciation of the fact that the relation between Marxism and philosophy might pose a very important theoretical and practical problem. For professors of philosophy, Marxism was at best a rather minor subsection within the history of 19th century philosophy, dismissed as the decay of Hegelianism. But Marxists as well," he puts Marxists in scare quotes, "as well tended not to lay great stress on the philosophical side of their theory, although for quite different reasons. Marx and Engels, it is true, often indicated with great pride that historically the German workers' movement had inherited the legacy of classical German philosophy in scientific socialism. And by classical German philosophy, again, it's German idealism. It's Kant and Hegel. It's the 25 years of philosophy, the birth and culmination and completion of philosophy between Kant and Hegel. But they did not mean by this that scientific socialism or scientific communism were primarily philosophies. They rather saw the task of their scientific socialism as that of definitively overcoming and superseding the form and content not only of all previous bourgeois idealist philosophy, but thereby a philosophy altogether. It says, later I shall have to explain in more detail what, according to the original conception of Marx and Engels, the nature of this supersession was or was intended to be. For the moment, I merely record that historically, this issue simply ceased to be a problem as far as most later Marxists were concerned. The manner in which they dealt with the question of philosophy can best be described in the vivid terms in which Engels once described Feuerbach's attitude to Hegelian philosophy. Feuerbach simply shoved it unceremoniously aside. In fact, very many later Marxists, apparently in highly orthodox compliance with the master's instructions, dealt in exactly the same unceremonious way not only with Hegelian philosophy, but with philosophy as a whole. Franz Mehring, who was a colleague, a collaborator, and a fellow communist with Rosa Luxemburg in Germany, and he wrote a very important biography of Marx. But he also wrote a lot on philosophy, indeed, interestingly enough. Franz Mehring more than once laconically described his own orthodox Marxist position on the question of philosophy by saying that he accepted the rejection of all philosophic fantasies, which was the precondition for the master's immortal accomplishments. This statement came from a man who could with justice say that he had concerned himself with the philosophical origins of Marx and Engels more thoroughly than anyone else. And it is extremely significant for the generally dominant position on all philosophical problems found among the Marxist theoreticians of the Second International. Again, I mentioned that the Second International was founded on the centenary, the 100th anniversary of the French Revolution in 1889, but then really ended from the perspective of communists like Korsch with World War I in 1914. Even though the Second International actually still exists, the Socialist International still exists. But these communists considered it dead and buried by then. The prominent Marxist theoreticians of the period regarded concern with questions that were not even essentially philosophical in the narrower sense, but were only related to the general epistemological and methodological bases of Marxist theory, as at most an utter waste of time and effort. Of course, whether they liked it or not, they allowed discussion of such philosophical issues within the Marxist camp, and in some circumstances they took part themselves. But when doing so, they made it quite clear that the elucidation of such problems was totally irrelevant to the practice of proletarian class struggle, and would always have to remain so. Such a conception was, however, only self-evident and logically justified given the premise that Marxism as a theory and practice was in essence totally unalterable and involved no specific position on any philosophical questions whatsoever. This meant that it was not regarded as impossible, for example, for a leading Marxist theoretician to be a follower of Arthur Schopenhauer in his private philosophical life. So that's a loaded reference. Schopenhauer was a famous rejecter and critic, a savage critic of Hegel. They were both professors in Berlin at around the same time, and Schopenhauer was really pissed that Hegel was so popular. You know, everyone wanted to take Hegel's classes, fewer people wanted to take Schopenhauer's classes, and so he complained about how, Hegel was nonsensical. I think that we encountered Schopenhauer at the end of the preface to Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, where Lukács says, well, of course, Marxism is going to appear to people like Hegelian philosophy as illogical or irrational. And this will be because people don't appreciate the dialectic. And so this loaded reference here is very similar. It's like, oh, Marxists even consider themselves to be privately, philosophically Schopenhauerian. Now, he might be overstating the case here, meaning to say that Marxism as a theory and practice was, in essence, totally unalterable and involved no specific position on any philosophical questions whatsoever. So let's unpack that a bit. In some ways, what he's saying is that philosophical questions were avoided in Marxism because philosophical questions would tend to suggest and involve further philosophical development, and that's what people thought Marxism did not require, and indeed would be harmed by any kind of philosophical revision. So he's starting to get at some of what Lukács was addressing namely a kind of reification of Marxism, a kind of dogmatization of Marxism, and also a vulgarization of Marxism, namely that a kind of propagandistic version of Marxism substituted for an actual rigorous theoretical Marxism. He says, during that period, therefore, however great the contradictions between Marxist and bourgeois theory were in all other respects, so between 1889 and 1914, on this one point there was an apparent agreement between the two extremes. Bourgeois philosophers of philosophy reassured each other that Marxism had no philosophical content of its own, and thought there was something important against it. Orthodox Marxists also reassured each other that their Marxism by its very nature had nothing to do with philosophy, and thought they were saying something important in favor of it. There was yet a third trend that started from the same basic position, and throughout this period, it was the only one to concern itself somewhat more thoroughly with the philosophical side of socialism. It consisted of those philosophizing socialists of various kinds who saw their real task as that of supplementing the Marxist system with ideas from cultural philosophy or with notions from Kant, Dietzken, or Mach, or other philosophies. Yet precisely because they thought that the Marxist system needed philosophical supplements, they made it quite clear that in their eyes Marxism in itself lacked philosophical content. All right, so notice he's setting up a little bit of a dialectic here. There were people who thought Marxism was unphilosophical, and that was bad. They thought that there were others who thought that Marxism was unphilosophical, and they thought that was good. And then there were those who thought Marxism was unphilosophical and tried to supplement it, tried to add to it. He says, nowadays it is rather easy to show that this purely negative conception of the relation between Marxism and philosophy, namely that Marxism was unphilosophical or philosophically lacking, like unphilosophical in either positive or negative sense, or unphilosophical in a deficiency sense. But this negative conception of the relation between Marxism and philosophy, which we have shown to be held in apparent unanimity among bourgeois scholars as well as by Orthodox Marxists, arose in both cases from a very superficial and incomplete analysis of historical and logical development. However, the conditions under which they both came to this conclusion, in part, diverge greatly, and so I want to describe them separately. It will then be clear that in spite of the great difference between the motives on either side, the two sets of causes do coincide in one crucial place. Among bourgeois scholars in the second half of the 19th century, there was a total disregard of Hegel's philosophy, which coincided with the complete incomprehension of the relation of philosophy to reality and of theory to practice, which constituted the living principle of all philosophy and science in Hegel's time, also in Kant's time. On the other hand, Marxists simultaneously tended in exactly the same way increasingly to forget the original meaning of the dialectical principle. Yet it was this that the two young Hegelians, Marx and Engels, when they were turning away from Hegel in the 1840s, had quite deliberately rescued from German idealist philosophy and transferred to the materialist conception of history and society. Namely, the relation, the living principle of all philosophy, and the relation between theory and practice, between philosophy and reality. Okay. So, let's consider this in two different respects. We've already talked about the immanent dialectical critique of phenomena. Let's go back to the contradiction of capitalism. let me bring up that chart, and we'll see how this applies to philosophy in a logical sense. And we'll also look at the historical sense. All right. Here, let me share my screen with you guys. Again, just to map out what we've been talking about. All right, so if for Marx, capitalism, or the capitalist mode of production, is characterized by a contradiction, manifests as a contradiction between bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production, then one way of describing that is the contradiction between the ideological superstructure and the socioeconomic base, the contradiction of consciousness and social being, the contradiction of practice and theory and their historical conditions. Now we will also see that because this contradiction is not between two different things, but two sides of the same thing, that means that each side is itself self-contradictory. So again, that means that the bourgeois social relations in capitalism are self-contradictory. The ideological superstructure in capitalism is self-contradictory, as is the socioeconomic base. Social being is self-contradictory in capitalism, and therefore consciousness is self-contradictory. The historical conditions, the dual-layered temporality, the bourgeois versus industrial historical conditions are self-contradictory, and theory and practice can be in contradiction with each other. Also, by the way, practice is self-contradictory in capitalism, and theory is self-contradictory in capitalism. That's why we have reification in both theory and practice. We have reified consciousness, thing-like subjectivity, at both a practical and a theoretical level. A divorce of theory and practice, in which our theory is contemplative, so that we are even alienated from our practice, from how we act. And that, again, this has a temporal character. The temporal character is that the ideological superstructure, consciousness, both practice and theory, lag behind the historical conditions, lag behind the social being, lag behind the socioeconomic base, lag behind the industrial forces of production, as well as the industrial forces of production, the socioeconomic base, social being, and historical conditions outstripping, undermining, and destroying the bourgeois social relations, the ideological superstructure, consciousness, and our practice and theory are outstripped, undermined, and destroyed in capitalism. So it's not just a lag, it's also an outstripping. It's dual movement. Now, okay, that's the logical form in which it takes. Now, of course, philosophy in this respect, even the philosophy that's a philosophy of practice, would be a function of consciousness, including practical consciousness. We'll see that he says that philosophies live on in everyday life, in the practices of everyday life. The ideological superstructure, bourgeois philosophy is an expression of, but is also constitutive of, bourgeois social relations. This last bit, how philosophy might be constitutive of social relations. So I've mentioned that before bourgeois society, social relations were religious in nature. So our relation to each other, our relation to nature, to everything that exists, all of existence, all of creation, our relation to ourselves is via religion. And religion is a form of consciousness, a form of self-consciousness. So in that respect, religious consciousness determines reality as much as reality determines religious consciousness. And something similar is going on here with commodity fetishism. That's the analogy that Marx was drawing, is that commodity fetishism is like a religion. Like a religion in that it is a practical cosmology and not merely a belief system. It's a fundamental, intuitive, and felt moral reality, not just an idea, not a mere belief system or a mere idea, but something that people believe whether they formally and self-consciously articulate it to themselves or not. It's the spontaneous appearance of reality, not only theoretically, but practically. It's a cosmology. And philosophy descends from religion. And the big struggle of bourgeois philosophy was to distinguish itself from Christianity, from Christian religion, from a kind of Christian metaphysics, out of which it emerged and from which it inherited a great deal. But nonetheless, it was supposed to be the self-overcoming of that prior metaphysics. All right, now here's the gamble that Korsch has in the way he's looking at it, taking on this subject, trying to find how through philosophy bourgeois society and capitalism point beyond themselves. So how to do that? He mentions logically and historically in the passage we were just reading. Logically and historically. I think that I used that language before when describing Das Kapital, but also Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, that it has a logical presentation and then it sort of restarts with a historical presentation. So we did the logical, now let's do the historical. The historical is the history of philosophy, which Korsch thinks is very important, very indicative, very illuminating. Namely, the 25 years of philosophy, from Kant's mature critical philosophy up through Hegel's philosophy. 25 years of philosophy coinciding with the period of the French Revolution, the turn of the 19th century. Then the crisis of Hegelianism. The crisis of Hegelianism. So Hegel is an incredibly influential philosopher, still today, but especially in his own time and immediately after his time. So in the immediate aftermath, in the early 19th century, up through the mid-19th century, Hegel's philosophy was massively influential, not just in Germany, but elsewhere. In England and France and the United States, for example, and in Italy. But there was a crisis of Hegelianism, and there was a disintegration and a decay of Hegelianism that took place nonetheless. That coincides with the period of the Industrial Revolution. So the decay of Hegelianism, the crisis of Hegelianism, is historically contemporaneous with the emergence of the proletariat as an objective phenomenon, the proletarianized working class, proletarianized labor in industrial capitalism, and with the subjective phenomenon, the rise of a modern socialist and communist movement. Socialism, which is really a totally new modern thing, as opposed to communism, which has some antecedents in religious communism prior to this time. Right, so all these things are happening at the same time, 1830s and 40s, when Marx and Engels are arriving on the scene in their early 20s, in the 1840s, coming to consciousness at this moment of the crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism, manifested by the commercial crisis, hungry 1840s, and the discontents of the proletarianized working class and their new movement and class struggle for socialism. Right, so crisis of Hegelian philosophy, crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism happening around the same time. Crisis of revolutionary ideology, socialism, because there was also a crisis of socialism. Not only did socialism emerge, but it immediately became self-divided. It immediately manifested self-contradictions. So one of the things that Marx and Engels called attention to, Marx in the writings, the letter to Ruga and the 1844 manuscripts, Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, is that there's individualist communism, now we call it anarchism, and then there's collectivist communism. And that would be a kind of state socialism. So that's already there in the 1830s and 40s, especially in the 1840s. And in some ways, that persists. That division within socialism and communism persists. Up to this day, in fact. And that this is, for Marx and Engels, simply a subspecies, a phenomenon, a subset of phenomena in bourgeois social and political movements, in bourgeois consciousness, in bourgeois politics, in capitalist politics, there's this division between individualism and collectivism. So that also is in the socialist and communist movement as well. Then Korsch says there's a curious gap in the history of philosophy, namely in the middle of the 1800s. Circa 1848, the revolutions of 1848 and their aftermath, but also this crisis of the 1840s. So we could say 1840s, 50s, into the 60s, there's a gap in the history of philosophy. Not entirely, but largely. There's a noticeable gap. Before philosophy picks up again, starts to attain a kind of vitality and movement in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s. But that takes the form of neo-Kantianism, and also shadowed soon after by neo-Hegelianism. So in some ways, bourgeois philosophy tries to resume and ignore that it had gone through a crisis in the early and mid-1800s. It tries to sort of pick up and avoid this crisis in the mid-1800s. The crisis that is indicated by the gap in the history of philosophy. That is also contemporaneous with Marx and Engels' full formulation of Marxism. Right? And that's why Marxism doesn't really fit in the history of philosophy, because there is this funny gap when thinking about the history of philosophy. So they're a kind of tangent or kind of offshoot of Hegelianism that is safely ignored because then philosophy seems to continue regardless. But it's neo-Kantianism, neo-Hegelianism, meaning it's not the original philosophy of Kant and Hegel. In some ways, it's even worse than what Marx had said about the young Hegelians, about the ready-made character, rather than the authentic working through, the authentic philosophy of classical German philosophy, German idealist philosophy, modern idealist philosophy, Kant and Hegel, 25 years of philosophy. It repeats, but in a degraded form, with neo-Kantianism, neo-Hegelianism. Usually neo means less than the original. It's like a retread that's less than the original. Now there are a couple of other figures that we could name quickly that would help illuminate this gap. And though those will be important later when we get to Adorno, they also show up a little bit here, but they will be important for next week. And those are Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Kierkegaard in the first half of the 1800s and middle 1800s, Nietzsche more in the latter 1800s, in the latter 19th century. So Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, who themselves then leave a legacy that's taken up in the 20th century in existentialism. So existentialism in the 20th century finds its founders and precursors, antecedents in its predecessors in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. And Robert Pippin mentioned them in the On Critical Theory piece that we read on the first day of class. Neo-Kantianism and Neo-Hegelianism. How philosophy tries to continue undeterred by its own crisis and gap in the middle 1800s, in the middle of the 19th century. Those are contemporaneous with Marxism. And actually, in the period of the Second International, in the period of the Socialist International, there are Marxists who try to, he mentions some here, try to supplement Marxism with Neo-Kantianism or Neo-Hegelianism, who draw from contemporary philosophy to supplement Marxism. So there's orthodox Marxism that largely ignores philosophy, and then the Marxists who are concerned with philosophy then try to supplement it. And what do they supplement it with? They supplement it with this Neo-Kantianism and Neo-Hegelianism. In that way, sharing the same moment as, but incorporating into themselves this sidestepping of the crisis of philosophy and the gap in the history of philosophy. Now, I want to say something about this just because, is Marxism about economic history when talking about the history of capitalism? Or are we talking about economic history? Are we talking about social history? Are we talking about political history? There are these revolutions. There's the American and French revolutions. There's the revolutions of 1848. There's, I mentioned, the Paris Commune at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. You could sort of mark and see manifesting in history these political events that could give us a view of capitalism as a political phenomenon. So the emergence and crisis of the modern democratic republic, modern politics, modern democracy. You could tell the story of capitalism that way, and not just through the economics of commerce. What would it mean to tell the history of capitalism as a history of philosophy? That's really what Korsch is raising here. He's saying, let's tell the history of capitalism through the history of philosophy, and how do Marx and Engels therefore fit within the history of philosophy? So Marx and Engels seem to fit within the history of commercial economics. They seem to fit within the social history of the emergence of the modern industrial working class, the proletarianized working class, a kind of sociological history or socioeconomic history or social history. They seem to fit within a political history. They're revolutionaries of 1848, and in that way distinct from the revolutionaries of 1776 or 1789. And they seem to inspire later revolutionaries, the revolutionaries of, be part of a movement, inform a broader socialist communist movement, including anarchists, informing the politics of the Paris Commune. And after all, Marx and Engels identified themselves with the Paris Commune. The anarchists accused them of trying to appropriate the Paris Commune. And then, of course, there's Marxism's role in the revolutions of 1917, 1918, 1919, Russia, Germany, Hungary, etc., Italy. But what about how Marx and Engels fit into the history of philosophy? Right, so it seems more clear how Marx and Engels fit into the history of economics, politics, social history. But how do they fit into the history of philosophy? How do they fit into philosophical history? That's been the neglected problem as far as Korsch is concerned. And then furthermore, how do we understand history? So we could understand history of the modern world as, again, capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, is an economic crisis of bourgeois social relations in the form of the value of labor as a commodity in exchange. So you could understand the modern world as the crisis of bourgeois social relations, bourgeois economics, crisis of the market system in the Industrial Revolution, crisis of market exchange based on labor as value. You could understand it as a political crisis. Capitalism is a political crisis. It's a crisis of bourgeois democracy or of modern liberal democratic republicanism, the modern democratic republic, liberalism. You could see the 19th century as the manifestation of the crisis of the principles, the political principles and constitutions of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. What would it mean to understand capitalism as the crisis of bourgeois philosophy? Capitalism is a crisis of, in this sense, philosophy per se, meaning modern, critical, scientific philosophy as opposed to its more historically antique and obsolete forms, traditional philosophy. So you can understand capitalism as the crisis of philosophy and not just the crisis of economics or the crisis of politics, but as the crisis of philosophy. And you could see Marxism as intervening not only in the crisis of bourgeois economics in capitalism or bourgeois politics in capitalism, but Marxism is an intervention in the crisis of bourgeois philosophy in capitalism. It's participating in the crisis of philosophy and not only participating in the crisis of economics and politics. That's what Korsch is putting on the table. Where philosophy itself is defined by its crisis, in the same way that politics is defined by its crisis, and in the same way that economics is defined by its crisis in capitalism. I'll say something about that, the crisis of politics. He calls it Bonapartism in philosophy. What he means by that is something very specific that Marx wrote about in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. It's about the results of the revolutions of 1848, the failure of the revolutions of 1848, that Marx saw the state rising above society and trying to manage capitalism as a result of the failure to achieve a social republic or socialism in the revolutions of 1848. And that's what Marx called Bonapartism. So the state, the role of the state in society as a symptom of the crisis of capitalism. In this way, the state tries to manage from above the crisis of society and capitalism. This is the new role of philosophy. So where Kant and Hegel saw themselves as articulating philosophy as their own time comprehended in thought, and Kant said that he was just technically, formally formulating what everyone knew as common sense and the intelligence of the average worker in society. Now philosophy was asked to do something else, do something different. It's not to express the reality that exists, but to try to manage it, to try to control it. So philosophy is supposed to solve the problem of society and capitalism in some way. People reach to philosophy as a solution to the crisis of capitalism, in the same way that they reach to the state to solve the crisis of economic, society, and politics in capitalism. The state is supposed to solve the political crisis too. The police are supposed to manage and control the political conflicts within capitalism. So Bonapartism in the state, Bonapartism in philosophy. That's why he's going to analogize the task of overcoming philosophy in this sense of being a symptom of capitalism, in the same way that the task is to overcome the state. The necessity of the state in capitalism must be overcome in socialism. In the same way, the necessity of philosophy in capitalism must be overcome. So again, it could be seen as a political struggle, as an economic struggle. Now he's posing it as a philosophical struggle. And yet one that the economic struggle proceeds through economic self-contradiction, the political struggle proceeds through political self-contradiction, the philosophical struggle proceeds through philosophical self-contradiction, or through the self-contradiction of philosophy. All right, let's take a short break, and then we'll come back and get into the notes that you guys posted, so we can look at the text in more detail. Okay, see you in a few minutes. Okay, let's resume. Alright, I'm going to turn to the notes that you guys posted for tonight's class. We have notes from Brett and from Emily. And let me see. I thought that I also saw. No, I guess not. Okay, I thought I saw some other posting. Alright, I'll share my screen with you guys and we'll look at the notes. Okay, Emily, would you like to take us through your notes?
Yeah, I feel like the first part of class gave a lot of necessary context.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of speculating a lot
Mm-hmm.
with regards to the context at the start, but I picked out 3 quotes that I felt like I wanted to hear more about the context for.
Mm-hmm.
I think that still holds up somewhat with
Mm-hmm.
these. And the first one is from near the start, which is more about, like, you said the dialectic between bourgeois philosophy and the, like, Marxism, and I thought it was just interesting that it sounded like Korsch was saying that bourgeois society has abandoned the Hegelian dialectic and gone back to earlier forms of philosophy
Right.
in order to avoid having to deal with Marxism as a form of philosophy.
Right.
But it would conflict with their interest. And I guess I was interested in exploring more about, like, why this would conflict more with them as opposed to scientific socialism. I know they talked about that a little bit, but I just kind of wanted to hear a bit more about that, I guess.
Okay, so let's think about where Kant came from. So when we did Kant, I did a little gloss on Kant in order to, sort of explain how he was trying to be dialectical. And there I said that the big controversy in philosophy in Kant's time, in formal philosophy, not in sort of the general Enlightenment and social and political philosophy. but in formal philosophy, was between empiricism and rationalism, which is not the same, but is related to idealism and materialism. So we could say that rationalism is like idealism, empiricism is like materialism. They're actually different, but in any case. So empiricism was David Hume, and rationalism was like Descartes and others. So you could also say that Spinoza was a kind of rationalist. So empiricism especially is something that seems to be more scientific, rather than rationalism, which still had some, apparently, holdovers from religious metaphysics. So empiricism is, we know the world through sense data perception. We know it through empirical experience. And rationalism is, we know the world through our rational faculties. And it would appear that Kant is more of a rationalist than an empiricist. But what he wanted to do was take up that antinomy, or that division between rationalism and empiricism, and try to understand it. Try to understand how they're related to each other in their opposition, and try to transcend that opposition in his own critical philosophy. Right. In that way, try to explain rationalism, but without a traditional understanding of metaphysics. So I think Robert Pippin described this as post-metaphysical philosophy. Now, post-metaphysical philosophy is not unmetaphysical philosophy or anti-metaphysical philosophy. And actually, it seems like philosophy itself is metaphysics, is metaphysical, makes metaphysical claims. And so empiricism, like the physical sciences, seems to take a different route. It seems to be like science versus philosophy. So insofar as bourgeois thought, philosophy in the loose sense of the term, not in the formal sense of the term. So maybe small p philosophy, one's philosophy, in a kind of loose sense. In a colloquial sense, rather than capital P philosophy in a formal sense, the formal discipline of philosophy. It would appear that bourgeois society turns away from dialectical philosophy in favor of empirical science in the 1800s. And we're going to see that, Lukács said this, and Korsch is dealing with this, and Adorno will deal with this also. Positivism as a kind of empiricism and related to the empirical sciences. The sciences based on empirical observation, so the physical sciences, but also insofar as the social sciences and even the human sciences also take on this kind of empiricist approach. So that's one obvious way that starting in the 19th century, there's a shying away from Hegel, definitely, but also Kant, also Rousseau, also Adam Smith. So Adam Smith, as a moral philosopher doing political economy, we could say that we know actually for a fact in the 1800s, economics is a new discipline that's actually quite different from political economy and is much more quantitative and much more about empirical data and statistical analysis, in the way that Lukács talked about this, about how society appears to be a statistical phenomenon, and that there's an inability to grasp the substance of society and therefore the substance of things. And again, even substance, it's a metaphysical word, right? The essence of things. These are metaphysical kinds of categories and metaphysical kind of concerns. So, insofar as it doesn't go in that direction, in an or anti-metaphysical direction, then it goes in the direction of more existentialist and like modern theology. It goes in the 1800s in directions that also point back to earlier forms of bourgeois consciousness that are more frankly traditional philosophical, traditional metaphysical, even theological in character, as opposed to empiricism, which seems to be more about the empirical sciences. Right, so whether in very counterposed ways, there's a retreat back, starting in the 1800s, he thinks. And again, not only in formal philosophy or even in small p colloquial philosophy, but also in the other sciences. So again, in the other sciences, in the social and human sciences, there's also a kind of retreat into empiricism, but also into a kind of traditional metaphysics or even theological way of grasping things, conceiving of things. I mentioned Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. There are many other examples. And I think that Lukács talked about this in The Standpoint of the Proletariat, like cultural philosophy. That's a term that Korsch also used early on in the passage that we read from the beginning of Marxism and philosophy. Cultural philosophy, which posits culture as a kind of essence or substance of things, but also as a kind of irrational datum that you can't make sense of in itself, but you must sort of take for granted. Right? That would also be a kind of retreat, but it's not like a linear retreat. It's not like one just goes back to an earlier stage, because again, going back to something, it's actually less the second time around. It's sort of in a degraded or debased way. Right? So he's observing this. And he, of course, as a Marxist, thinks that implicitly, if not explicitly, although often explicitly, this is done in reaction to Marxism. It's definitely done in reaction to Hegelianism, explicitly. Is it done explicitly against Marxism? Often yes. Often implicitly, because it's about turning away from certain kinds of questions. And really turning away from a certain approach to questions, namely a dialectical approach to questions. So turning away from thinking about not even the question of contradiction, but the question of how history is moving, where is it going, does it point beyond itself, is there a qualitative transformation that seems possible? Or is historical time just sort of more of the same, meaning kind of continue things from the past, and then the future is seen as a projection of that same movement? The future is just seen as a projection of the present, not as its qualitative transformation. Maybe it's positive or negative fulfillment, but basically a kind of linear result of where we are now, and the past is seen as a linear antecedent to where we are now. Right, so that would also involve stepping aside from a dialectical view of history, for example, articulated by not only Hegel but Kant. But again, there is this idea that Hegel more fully developed and brought out everything in Kant. Whether or not that's true, but that is how Hegel thought of himself, and it's how Marxists thought of the relationship between Kant and Hegel, and it's also how Hegelians thought about the relationship between Kant and Hegel. And like I said, Hegel seems like one philosopher among many, and a kind of controversial philosopher, and a kind of uncomfortable, awkward philosopher to us now, but at the time, hugely influential. Meaning everyone felt the need to respond to Hegel, to either accept or reject, or try to elaborate on. Hegel. So does that help?
Yeah, so it's not necessarily just specifically Marxism, but it's part of like a broader trend
Mm-hmm.
among the bourgeois thought.
Mm-hmm. And we could also say that Marxism, insofar as Marxism loses its own plot, that Marxism itself takes on that character. It takes on a kind of utopian theological kind of faith in progress, like kind of belief in social historical progress, or Marxism can become, and it can also, I should say, it can become a kind of church of the working class. It can become a kind of religion of the proletariat. Or conversely, Marxism can become empiricist. It can become just another variety, or it's sort of the same but with maybe a different set of concerns as other kind of economic analyses. Right. So it could be like an empirical analysis of socioeconomics and, the economic effects on politics, but from the standpoint of championing the working class. Right, that's the only difference that Marxism would have, that it would be essentially the same kind of empirical social or economic or political science, but just from the vantage point of championing the working class. No. Of course, she's saying no. So it's not only the alternative to Marxism, but it also is how he thinks of what happens to Marxism itself as part of this general trend.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Cool. What's your second quote?
The second quote is from like towards the middle,
Mm-hmm.
where it's talking about Marx and Engels aiming to eventually overcome and supersede philosophy. And I know that you touched on this a bit at the start of the class,
Mm-hmm.
but I was also curious because I interpreted this in part to be because becoming a philosopher, like philosophy at the time, was kind of more of a bourgeois type career
like
path.
elite activity. Mm-hmm.
And if it was in part because it was inherently linked to the elite.
Well, certainly that doesn't help the case for philosophy, right? That it becomes more elitist than even Kant or Hegel wanted it to be. And certainly more elitist than Rousseau wanted it to be, or Adam Smith wanted it to be, for example. But maybe that's secondary and not primary, meaning maybe it's because philosophy exhibited this problem that it became something that could be kind of locked up in an elite kind of isolation. Right, that philosophy could lose its contact with everyday life and reality. Right, and again, that would be a phenomenon of capitalism itself. So, again, thinking about it in political terms, I don't know if I put it just this way, but I will now. One could say, this simply, capitalism is a crisis of democracy. That it creates a new social hierarchy and inequality that was not foreseen by the American or French revolutionaries. Because even though they acknowledged there were rich and poor people, still they thought everyone had a role to play in society and that the rich couldn't really control things. They could try to control things, but that would be seen as unjust and it would be distorting. And the idea was that society could mitigate against that attempt to usurp control by the rich. And yet, that is what happened. In other words, that society did seem to be divided between capitalists and the working class. And it did seem like capitalists had arrogated control over things in a way that the society was not supposed to allow, and also that would be manifestly unhealthy for the society, and yet it could continue. It could perpetuate itself in capitalism in a way that, again, the earlier bourgeois revolutionaries would have thought that if it did happen, it couldn't last. Right, so they had more faith in the power of the people and the working class, the bourgeois philosophers and bourgeois revolutionary politicians, than seemed to be warranted given what happened in capitalism, where the capitalists really do appear to arrogate a direction of society. Now, I will say, crisis of democracy, not only the role of a capitalist ruling class, but really the state. And it's always a question of the state, meaning, is it that the state is controlled by rich people? Except it also seems like the state is not controlled by rich people, but the state has a kind of life of its own, that even rich people can fall victim to the state, the power that the state has over society. Right, so there are different ways that this appears. And again, one could say, well, philosophy is like this, that a wealthy capitalist ruling class becomes alienated and isolated from society. The state becomes alienated and isolated from society, seems to be in battle with society in some important ways. And like that, philosophy appears to be alienated and isolated and embattled in society. Now, I will say one other thing, because other classes that I teach at SAIC, something similar happens with art. So a kind of bourgeois humanistic notion of art that's very kind of democratic, as well as very liberal. In the 19th century, in the 1800s, art's position in society becomes deeply problematic and uncertain. And art also seems to be alienated and isolated from society, and seems to be locked up in a kind of elite domain, separated from everything else. And that's really peculiar given the way, like, artists coming out of the Renaissance understood in a more humanistic way the role and place of art in the world and in society. Right? That kind of universalist notion of art seems belied by what happens to art in capitalism. So that's just a sort of a side note. But a parallel between philosophy and art would also be observable, starting in the 1800s. And all the way up to today. Still the case. Art seems isolated, alienated from society, locked up in a kind of elite place where its role and function in society is uncertain or problematic. Right. So philosophy is supposed to express common sense. Well, that is not what happened to philosophy. So philosophy in the capitalist era seems wholly counterintuitive and seems to make sense only in its own terms and not at all in commonsensical terms. It seems to inhabit its own logical universe rather than be the expression of everyday life. And in that way, it becomes like theology. It becomes like theology contemplating the mystery of creation that we're never supposed to figure out, and that you have to be an initiate to even begin to start to think in this way. That's not what philosophy in the bourgeois era was supposed to be. It was supposed to be more democratic. It was supposed to really permeate and be an expression of social reality. Remember, philosophy became worldly and the world became philosophical. Well, in capitalism, that seems to be betrayed. In the same way that the state was supposed to be democratic. It was supposed to serve the people, but then the people seem to have to serve the state. I don't know if that all makes sense, but those are the parallels that are being drawn.
Definitely makes sense. I think the theology comparison makes a lot of sense and is really illuminating.
Right. So it's an irony of history, we might say, that philosophy is defined by its departure from and distinction from theology, and yet ends up there. And even the way like logical philosophy operates, like logical problems, they seem like Platonic forms. If you guys know anything about Plato, they seem like Platonic forms. Meaning they have some relation to reality, but really they occupy their own domain, and the world is just the imperfect projection of these Platonic forms. It seems like the world is some imperfect projection of philosophical logical forms. And it's like, yeah, that's not what it's supposed to be at all. That's the exact opposite of what it's supposed to be. Okay, let's look at your third quotation.
This is kind of related to the first two and to what we've been talking about the whole time, with the idea that I thought the idea of orthodox Marxists was really interesting, especially because I know that one of them that's mentioned, Lenin, has come up especially a lot, and talking about how scientific socialism had inevitably ceased to be a theory of social revolution. And I thought it's kind of interesting that Korsch is apparently saying that turning it from more of that theological edge into more of the empirical edge robs it some kind of revolutionary quality. And I couldn't really articulate why that is, but it did kind of make sense to me at the same time.
So he's got a quotation from Marx, where Marx says, humanity only sets itself the tasks that it can solve. And then Korsch comments on this and says that this is not contradicted by the fact that sometimes the past had a more advanced task than the present. That we might have fallen below a task that was, and a consciousness of that task that had been achieved earlier. Now, what he means by that directly is that, he thinks that he calls it the three periods of Marxism. He calls it the original first phase of Marxism, which is the consciousness of revolution in 1848, of socialist or communist revolution in the Industrial Revolution and capitalism in 1848. Then there's a kind of second period, and the second period is the period of the epigones, of the followers, and that's where they sort of fall below that revolutionary consciousness of 1848. And then there's the regaining of a revolutionary consciousness around 1917, but really in the crisis leading up to World War I and the revolutions that came after World War I. And that's why he associates Lenin and Luxemburg as part of the third phase, the third period of Marxism. And he talks about Karl Kautsky and Eduard Bernstein and others like Plekhanov as the exemplars of the second phase, the phase of the Second International or the Socialist International. So what he has to account for is how Lenin and Luxemburg see themselves as recovering the original Marxism of Marx and Engels and recovering the spirit of 1848. Now, this category of orthodox is tricky because orthodox almost is a self-indicting category. So it's orthodox versus revisionist. So there were the people who were trying to revise Marxism. And let's recall what that revision amounted to. The revision amounted to the idea that, in a way unanticipated by Marx and Engels, the working class had developed mass social organizations and political parties that allowed it to participate in society and politics and reform capitalism and evolve capitalism into socialism, rather than a kind of sharp political crisis of the state with, kind of street battles and civil war and then a revolutionary dictatorship coming out of that, the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's the sort of 1848 model. That they're revising Marxism to get rid of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but also to think of the transition of capitalism to socialism as more of a linear progressive evolution. And what's interesting is that those revisionists who thought that the working class had developed strength within capitalism that allowed it to reform capitalism into socialism, that they explicitly rejected the dialectic, that they explicitly rejected Hegelianism. By contrast, the orthodox Marxists defended that dialectical conception, and so the orthodoxy was specifically on the dialectic, but also on the revolution. In other words, rejecting the idea that it was going to be possible for the working class to reform capitalism into socialism in a linear, progressive, evolutionary way. There was this idea, rather, that no, there's going to be a contradiction, a crisis, and a revolution. Now, there's actually a passage from Lenin. Let me see if I can find this quickly, because I think it will help illustrate it. It's from the encyclopedia entry that Lenin wrote on Marx. It's on what Lenin called the Marxist doctrine. All right, let's see. I'll share my screen with you guys and show you the Lenin. So Lenin said, he quotes Engels. Lenin quotes Engels. Engels says, the great basic thought that the world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes in which the things apparently stable, no less than their mind images in our heads, or mental images in our heads, the concepts. So things and concepts go through an uninterrupted change of coming into being and passing away. This great fundamental thought has, especially since the time of Hegel, so thoroughly permeated ordinary consciousness that in this generality it is now scarcely ever contradicted. But to acknowledge this fundamental thought in words and to apply it in reality in detail to each domain of investigation are two different things. For dialectical philosophy, nothing is final, absolute, or sacred. It reveals the transitory character of everything and in everything. Nothing can endure before it except the uninterrupted process of becoming and passing away, the endless ascendancy from the lower to the higher, and dialectical philosophy itself is nothing more than the mere reflection of this process in the thinking brain. Thus, according to Marx, dialectics is, quote, the science of the general laws of motion, both of the external world and of human thought. And then Lenin continues, this revolutionary aspect of Hegel's philosophy was adopted and developed by Marx. Dialectical materialism, quote, does not need any philosophy standing above the other sciences. close quote. From previous philosophy there remains, quote, the science of thought and its laws, formal logic, and dialectics. Dialectics, as understood by Marx, and also in conformity with Hegel, includes what is now called the theory of knowledge or epistemology, studying and generalizing the origin and development of knowledge, the transition from non-knowledge to knowledge. And then Lenin says, in our times, the idea of development, of evolution, has almost completely penetrated social consciousness, only in other ways, and not through Hegelian philosophy. Still, this idea, as formulated by Marx and Engels on the basis of Hegel's philosophy, is far more comprehensive and far richer in content than the current idea of evolution is. And he describes it as a development that repeats, as it were, stages that have already been passed, but repeats them in a different way on a higher basis, the negation of the negation, a development, so to speak, that proceeds in spirals and not in a straight line, a development by leaps, catastrophes, and revolutions, breaks in continuity, the transformation of quantity into quality, inner impulses towards development, imparted by the contradiction and conflict of the various forces and tendencies acting upon a given body, or within a given phenomenon, or within a given society, the interdependence and the closest and indissoluble connection between all aspects of any phenomenon, history constantly revealing ever new aspects, a connection that provides a uniform and universal process of motion, one that follows definite laws. These are some of the features of dialectics as a doctrine of development that is richer than the conventional one. All right, so that's what was lost in general bourgeois thought, but also within Marxism itself. Within Marxism itself, that Hegelian conception of dialectical development, development through contradiction, was lost.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Right, so so it's a curious thing. We usually think of orthodox as dogmatic, but here it's something else. Now, he also distinguishes between revisionism and orthodoxy, on the one hand, that opposition, and what he calls reformism and revolution. Reformist and revolutionary Marxism. So that's a little bit different. And what he says is that while others defended orthodoxy against the revisionists, like Kautsky and Plekhanov, that actually in the revolution, they didn't support Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, but turned against them. So it turned out there was another division within Marxism other than the orthodox versus revisionist division. There was also a division between reformist and revolutionary. So even though the orthodox Marxists thought that they were preserving revolutionary Marxism against the reformist revisionism, they actually turned out not to have been able to sustain. And he thinks that that's due to the fact that their consciousness was from a reformist phase of the socialist movement, the phase of the building of the Second International, the Socialist International, the building up of these mass socialist parties in the late 1800s. Whereas Luxemburg and Lenin arrived, they're younger, they arrived on the scene when that mass movement and those mass political parties were coming into crisis. That's the crisis of Marxism, and that's the crisis of the purpose of Marxism. So I think that I mentioned that Bernstein is one of the explicit theorists of revisionist and reformist Marxism, that he says the movement is everything and the goal is nothing. What Luxemburg and Lenin say, by contrast, is that actually the movement and the goal are distinct. The goal is something, not nothing. And the movement and the goal are not only distinct, but might come into contradiction. In other words, the movement might come into self-contradiction. That the movement, like capitalism itself, the socialist movement, might exhibit a self-contradiction. And that could take the form of a contradiction between the movement and its goal. And that's what they thought happened to the Second International. That the Second International sought to perpetuate itself as a movement, but lost sight of its goal. And part of that is because the goal represented a crisis for that movement. Right, so that's where we're getting into the real political stakes of it. Right, so that's why he thinks that although formally the orthodox Marxists upheld a dialectical conception, that actually they lost the living substance of the dialectic, and that was preserved by Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, the revolutionary Marxists, who understood the crisis as not merely a crisis of capitalism or a crisis between socialism and capitalism, but recovered Marx's idea that the contradiction and crisis was also within socialism itself, within the working class itself, and therefore within its class struggle and its own socialist movement. Right, so this is the tricky part, because they observed it in the fact that when the revolutionary crisis came, the movement divided. It divided between the socialists and the communists. And I mentioned that the Socialist International still exists. The Communist International doesn't exist anymore. It was dissolved by Stalin during World War II, but also it would have ceased to exist anyway with the fall of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact Eastern European countries. Right, so whereas the Socialist International continues to exist, how does it continue to exist? It exists as a reformist capitalist politics. Right, so socialism now just means reforming, trying to take the edge off capitalism. And that's what the Socialist International parties represent. So the SPD in Germany now was not a revolutionary party anymore. It's a governing capitalist party. And it's part of the Second International. It's part of the Socialist International. That still exists. So is the Labour Party in the UK. Keir Starmer. These are capitalist parties. Capitalist parties of the working class. Capitalist parties with a working class base. Right, it's also what socialism means when people say the Democratic Party in the United States is socialist. That's what they mean. They mean like a capitalist reform party. They don't mean like a Lenin or a Rosa Luxemburg or Marxist like revolutionary party. No. All right, thanks, Emily. Let's see, is Brett here? Maybe not. Brett sent some notes, but may not be here. All right, let's see. In our last 15 minutes, how these notes might guide us a bit. Okay, here's a quotation. Among bourgeois scholars in the second half of the 19th century, there was a total disregard of Hegel's philosophy, which coincided with a complete incomprehension of the relation of philosophy to reality and of theory to practice, which constituted the living principle of all philosophy and science in Hegel's time. On the other hand, Marxists simultaneously tended in exactly the same way increasingly to forget the original meaning of the dialectical principle, yet they were turning away from Hegel in the 1840s, had quite deliberately rescued from German idealist philosophy and transferred to the materialist conception of history and society. So that's, I take that to be Marx and Engels. And then Brett's comment is that theory was tied to practice, and thought and reality are not separate, because thought produces reality. This is a key philosophical idea of Marx and Engels that over time became lost and produces a non-revolutionary Marxism. So thought producing reality, that sounds like idealism, and in a certain sense it is. So one way of thinking about it, that Lukács and Korsch both address, is that the crisis of Marxism and the degeneration of Marxism made Marxism into something objectivistic, So it's what we were talking about, the Marxism became reified. It lost the subjective aspect of things, the subjective factor of history and of historical change. And so reality produces thought, but thought also produces reality, meaning there is a dialectic between thinking and acting, or between thought and reality, between consciousness and social being. Also, between theory and practice, there's a dialectical interplay. Now, that sounds like idealism and subjectivistic, and indeed it might be, if taken up undialectically. Right. In other words, if taken up in such a way as to forget that theory and practice are in contradiction, and that thought and reality are in contradiction. So thought produces reality in a contradictory way. Reality produces thought in a contradictory way. Reality produces thought as reality's own self-contradiction, and thought produces reality as the self-contradiction of thought. This is the language that Marx was using in the excerpt from the dissertation we read to make the world philosophical from the Marx-Engels reader. Okay, and this is a later quotation from page 45 of the PDF. Any thorough elucidation of the relationship between Marxism and philosophy must start from the unambiguous statements of Marx and Engels themselves, that a necessary result of their new dialectical materialist standpoint was the supersession not only of bourgeois idealist philosophy, but simultaneously of all philosophy, as to obscure the fundamental significance of this Marxist attitude towards philosophy by regarding the whole dispute as a purely verbal one, implying that Engels simply bestowed a new name on certain epistemological principles known in Hegelian terminology as the philosophical aspect of sciences, which were substantially preserved in the materialist transformation of the Hegelian dialectic. There are, of course, some formulations in Marx, and especially the later Engels, which appear to suggest this. But, Korsch says, it is easy to see that philosophy itself is not abolished by a mere abolition of its name. Such purely terminological points must be dismissed in any serious examination of the relationship between Marxism and philosophy, or should we see it, like the abolition of the state, as a very long and arduous revolutionary process which unfolds through the most diverse phases? If so, what is the relationship of Marxism to philosophy so long as this arduous process has not yet attained its final goal, namely the abolition of philosophy? And then Brett comments, like the state, philosophy is a product of class society where thinking and doing are distinct practices. As theory and practice are merged, the necessity or relevance of a state and of philosophy become trivial. The way that Engels put it is that the governing of men will be replaced by the administration of things. Right, and we might say that there's already that desire, there already is that desideratum or aspiration within capitalism. Just turn politics, turn the state into a technocratic administration of things. But of course, under this system, that would mean fully suppressing any societal conflicts, suppressing politics, suppressing the contradiction of capitalism. That's what technocracy would seek to do. And from a Marxist perspective, that would not be possible. It would indeed produce a kind of grotesque result if you tried to suppress the contradiction in society. Here's the final quotation that Brett had us consider, and that's from page 76. The major weakness of vulgar socialism is that, in Marxist terms, it clings quite unscientifically to a naive realism. That's another category of antinomy, by the way. So I mentioned empiricism and rationalism. This would also have been known in the 18th century in Kant's time, that Kant wanted to transcend the antinomy of idealism and realism. Right, so naive realism, in which both so-called common sense which is the worst metaphysician, and the normal positivist science of bourgeois society draw a sharp line of division between consciousness and its object. So again, this sounds very much like Lukács on reification. For the coincidence of consciousness and reality characterizes every dialectic. So coincidence doesn't mean coincidence, like a kind of happy coincidence. It means more coinciding with. The coinciding of consciousness with reality characterizes every dialectic, including Marxist dialectical materialism. Its consequence is that the material relations of production of the capitalist epoch only are what they are in combination with the forms in which they are reflected in the pre-scientific and bourgeois scientific consciousness of the period, and they could not subsist in reality without these forms of consciousness. Now that repeats very much, it's very similar to Lukács in the preface, in the original 1922 preface to History and Class Consciousness, where he said that these one-sided categories in thought only attain their meaning in and through their contradiction in reality. Right, so subject and object, and even true and false, don't mean what they mean when they're taken out of their intrinsic relation with each other and are turned instead into a kind of flat opposition against each other. All right, let's see what Brett comments on this final quotation from Korsch. Brett writes, Marx and Engels thought about the relationship between the material world and our ideas as linked, insofar as the way we think about and justify material conditions actually create them. If people believe the market is natural, that becomes a material reality. That's certainly true. Now, the flip side would be that the material reality of the market makes people believe it is natural. Right, so the converse would also be true. And then Brett continues that Marx and Engels agreed with Hegel's idea that the world and our consciousness are bound together in an unfolding historical process. And then Brett continues, if the Hegelian dialectic is removed from the picture, then scientific socialism is just a reflection of the world as it is, not the world produced due to our ideas about it and our consciousness. Okay, let's talk about that. So yes, if the dialectic is removed from Marxism, if Marxism becomes undialectical, which is basically what happened. It happened both in the movement before the Russian Revolution and it happened in the aftermath. It happened in Stalinism. That Marxism became, in its scientific character, just an empirical description of reality as it is, the world as it is. Now, what about the world produced due to our ideas about it and due to our consciousness? Okay, that's where we're in the realm of the is and the ought. If we go back to Robert Pippin from the first day of class, right? So it seems, and Marx talked about this, that the world as a totality is the world torn apart. And one of the ways that it's torn apart is between its reality and its ideals. Again, the idealism versus realism distinction. But then what is the status of those ideals? Are they just fictions? Are they just myths? Or are they based in reality? In which case, the contradiction between a society, a social reality, a social world, social relations, the contradiction between those and our ideals would itself be an expression of a contradiction within the world itself. So it doesn't mean that we just throw the ideals out as myths or fictions. It means that we have to understand why there would be a contradiction between the ideals and the reality, especially because these ideals have their origin in reality. So that, again, goes to the contradiction that Marx describes in Capitalism between bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production. So the capitalist mode of production bourgeois social relations create bourgeois ideals, but then the industrial forces of production drive society onto a development that contradicts those ideals and points to the need to supersede those ideals. But those are our real ideals. And so we have to deal with those ideals not only being contradicted by reality, but also, therefore, those ideals becoming self-contradictory in themselves. And recognizing that as a function of how reality is contradictory in itself. So this is where the critique of philosophy, the immanent dialectical critique of philosophy, exploring how philosophy is a necessary form of appearance, is an appearance of the essence of things, however, pointing beyond itself, in and through its self-contradictory character. Because that would be a subset, that would be a phenomenon of how reality, through its self-contradiction, points beyond itself. So if the ideals seem to come into self-contradiction, to understand how that contradiction isn't just a sort of a dead end or an impasse, but might point beyond itself. Because that's expressing how reality itself has become self-contradictory and points beyond itself. And that gets us to our final line of the piece, which I want to read out only because it will be important when we come back to Adorno on Monday. He says, we'll look at the last couple of pages. He says, it is only this outlook that could sustain the view that all forms of economic consciousness, the economic conceptions of a pre-scientific and unscientific consciousness, as well as scientific economics itself, have an objective meaning because they correspond to a reality, the material relations of production which they comprehend, whereas all higher forms of representation are merely objectless fantasies which will automatically dissolve into their essential nullity after the overthrow of the economic structure of society and the abolition of its juridical and political superstructure. Then he says economic ideas themselves only appear to be related to the material relations of production of bourgeois society in the way an image is related to an object it reflects. In fact, they are related to them in the way that a specific, particularly defined part of a whole is related to other aspects of this whole. Bourgeois economics belongs with the material relations of production to bourgeois society as a totality. This totality also contains political and legal representations and their apparent objects, which bourgeois politicians and jurists, the ideologues of private property, treat in an ideologically inverted manner as autonomous essences. So he's saying, if it appears that economics and politics contradict each other, that's itself a significant phenomenon. Finally, it also includes the higher ideologies of art, religion, and philosophy of bourgeois society. If it seems that there are no objects which these representations can reflect correctly or incorrectly, this is because economic, political, or legal representations do not have particular objects which exist independently either, isolated from the other phenomena of bourgeois society. To counterpose such objects to these representations is an abstract and ideological bourgeois procedure. They merely express bourgeois society as a totality in a particular way, just as do art, religion, and philosophy. Their ensemble forms the spiritual structure of bourgeois philosophy, the geistig structure, to use Hegel's word, of bourgeois society, which corresponds to its economic structure, just as its legal and political superstructure corresponds to the same basis. All these forms must be subjected to the revolutionary social criticism of scientific socialism, which embraces the whole of social reality. They must be criticized in theory and overthrown in practice, together with the economic, legal, and political structures of society, and at the same time as them. Just as political action is not rendered unnecessary by the economic action of a revolutionary class, so intellectual action is not rendered unnecessary by either political or economic action. On the contrary, it must be carried through to the end in theory and practice as revolutionary scientific criticism and agitational work before the seizure of state power by the working class, and as scientific organization and ideological dictatorship after the seizure of state power. If this is valid for intellectual action against the forms of consciousness which define bourgeois society in general, it is especially true of philosophical action. Bourgeois consciousness necessarily sees itself as apart from the world and independent of it as pure critical philosophy and impartial science, just as the bourgeois state and bourgeois law appear to be above society. This consciousness, that in which these things appear to be separate and above, must be philosophically fought by the revolutionary materialist dialectic, which is the philosophy of the working class. This struggle will only end when the whole of existing society and its economic basis have been totally overthrown in practice, and this consciousness has been totally surpassed and abolished in theory. Quote, philosophy cannot be abolished without being realized. That's a quote from Marx. By the way, that goes to this term self-overcoming, the Selbstaufhebung, or the self-sublation, or the Aufhebung, which I described in the dialectic of being and becoming as paradoxical in that the self-overcoming is both a completion and an abolition, a fulfillment and a negation, and a transcendence and an abolition. So it has this, from this side of things, from our standpoint now in capitalism, it seems that what the world is aspiring towards is contradictory. It's aspiring to fulfill itself, but it's also aspiring to abolish itself. Philosophy seems to be aspiring to fulfill itself, but in its original bourgeois revolutionary form of Kant and Hegel, where the world was to become philosophical and philosophy was to become worldly, to fulfill itself that way, but also to abolish itself in that form because that corresponded to bourgeois revolution, bourgeois social relations, whereas now capitalism seems to point beyond that and to the possibility and necessity of overcoming it, which would therefore represent a revolutionary overthrow of philosophy, even in its highest form, in this Kantian Hegelian form. So it would mean overcoming the bourgeois philosophy of revolution, which otherwise Marxism is an outgrowth of and is connected to, but also recognizes has become self-contradictory in capitalism. And therefore Marxism understands the need to abolish itself. Certainly the need for socialist ideology, communist ideology to abolish itself. But even in a certain sense, Marxism aims to abolish itself. Okay, we've gone a little bit late, sorry about that, but I wanted to get that thought completed. So have a good weekend, and we will come back on Monday with Adorno. And I will send an announcement through Canvas enumerating the specific readings for Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday of next week. I'll do that right now after class.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good night, guys.